James. If you want to go ahead and get to James. If someone's got a red Bible, the ones that are on the table, maybe find what page that's on and call that out. So if someone needs to get there. In the New Testament, towards the end, right after the book of Hebrews, we spent last week there briefly going over the context. And I want to do a little recap today as we start. So let me see. 1233. Thank you. So first, I want to just a word on context, because we spent a whole session last week on context, on what's going on in the Bible or in history at this time. And I want to just explain to you again, as I might do this often, why do we do that? Why is that time worth spending in the context? How does that serve us? Because I think, one, it is an important step that we have to take as we approach the Bible. Because it is tempting, I think, to sometimes just open our Bible up, start reading, and looking for something that answers the question that we have at the time, looking for something that's relevant to us, looking for something that may make us feel good. And I would just argue that really, I think God wants us to experience something much deeper when we come to the Word, something much deeper. He wants us to learn who He is. He wants us to learn more about His heart. He wants us to watch and track the history of God's people throughout generations. He wants us to understand what's going. And He wants to reveal deep meaning, deep truth, and conviction as we read and meditate on His Word. And so one way that we prepare our heart and our mind to do this is we do some work on the context. We look to see what's going on in the context of when the book was wrote. And so we ask questions like, who wrote this book of the Bible, this specific book of the Bible? What's the genre? Who were they writing to? What's their audience? We ask things like, what was the history of God's people at the time? We ask, what's going on in the history of the world? Or things like, what was the issue? Was there a certain issue that the author may have been addressing that when we understand it, it begins to unlock certain truths about the Word that we may not have seen before? Was this before Jesus or after Jesus' life on earth? All of these things are really important questions for us to ask when we open up to any book of the Bible. And I want to tell you why we do it. Because I think it's not just for our head knowledge, but I think it protects and provides some safeguards for us, which is why I think it's so important that we do it. And so one, I think the work of context, the work of seeking to understand what was going on to the best of our abilities, should one, humble us and make us aware where we fall in the history of the world. I think sometimes we forget that we live in a specific cultural moment in 2024 America. We forget that we are one portion of a myriad of history of humans who have followed the Lord. And specifically in the context, like we are detached pretty far, what's the word? When you're talking about chronologically from when the author actually wrote the books of the Bible. And so we must be careful not to Americanize the Bible, not to read our own context into it. So one, it helps us and protects us from doing that. Second thing is it can bring about deeper meaning when we understand the context. Think about last week when we talked about, just at the beginning of the book of James, when he's addressing his audience, and he says to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. And so what we know, when we know the context, we know that he's writing to a church that has been dispersed. And this church is primarily ethnic Jews. These Jews who have followed God for generations, who are engulfed in the tradition and the law. And so when he says to the 12 tribes, he's hitting on their identity. He's reminding them who they are. He's saying, look, I know who you are. I know you are of the 12 tribes. So we know that he is being compassionate. He's bringing weight to his introduction. So there's just certain things about context that give us deeper meaning. Also, what it does is it protects us at times. It protects us from drawing a conclusion from the Word that God never intended us to draw. And so, for example, knowing that Paul was writing the letter to the Philippians from a jail cell in persecution provides context around what he meant when he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. right? His context helps us understand that what he was not saying is that you can accomplish all the dreams that you have. But when we understand his context, we see that Paul is saying that he has seen that with Christ, he can be content in both good and bad, in the good times and in the trials. So these are the types of things that context helps us see. So context is key. And so just a few of the things that we hit, I'm not in the slides, just a few of the things that we hit last week around context. Hit them here again, just as a reminder. So who is the author? So we said this is James, known as James the Just, the half-brother of Jesus. When was this wrote? So we're saying mid-40s AD. And so what's going on there? That's after the resurrection of Jesus. That's after his ascension. That's also right in the heart of the rise of the Roman Empire. And so Rome is just the pinnacle of power in the world. And so this is what's going on in the world at the time. Who's the audience? So who's he writing to? So we understand this to be a circulating letter to the church in Jerusalem who has been dispersed into the outer areas. And so this is a letter that's being passed around to these dispersed people and is addressing specific things that's going on in their life. Namely, here are some of the themes that we're going to see. This is not an exhaustive list, but just some of the things that when we look at it just on the surface that we see. So we see trials and temptations, which we'll dive into today. Hearing and doing the word of God. Avoiding favoritism, taming the tongue, wisdom, patience, caring for the vulnerable. And then this relationship between faith and works. Okay, and then if I would say there's one theme that we see in this book, one overarching theme, which all these things kind of serve to reinforce this theme, that is this, the revolutionary power of true faith. A faith that works, a faith that is put into action, a faith in practice, a faith that is effective. And so what we talked about last week is this is a faith that when we live out and we apply to our life, we experience a fuller life. And when we live out and apply our faith, the community around us is blessed. Like God gives us a way of life that when we live out in his world, it works and it flourishes. And so this is the revolutionary power of true faith. Now, just to round out this recap of context, and you'll hear me come back to this often, because I think this provides not just content, not just information for today's session, but all the time that we're going to walk through James here. We have to, I think, approach James with just a word of care, a word of caution, and not because we need to approach it with caution, but because there's things in our heart that we need to be aware of. So it was never James's intent for us to take the principles that are laid out here in this letter and to apply them as principles alone to improve our life. He never meant for us to leave here with a list of things to do so that we might find favor with God and favor with others. Okay? Because I think we are in a very task-driven culture that we are just quick to really we want to see things. It's like, hey, quick tips to improve this. Or here are 5 quick ways that you can get better at this. Here are 6 lifestyles to improve your life. We are drawn to that type of idea. And so it could be easy to go to the book of James and have a list of religious things to do so that we might feel that we feel better before the Lord. However, when we do that, we might find that ultimately that leaves us relatively hopeless and frustrated. Because at best, our good works, detached from a redeemed heart, stir up self-righteousness in us, thinking that we've done enough, thinking that we're better than others. Or on the other end, and worse, it leaves us hopeless because we never measure up. And so instead, rather than offering you a list of instruction, instead, let us see that first, God invites us to find new life in him, to find rest and freedom in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. His invitation is first to experience that life with Christ is a walk that has a light burden. There is freedom with Christ. And it's from that identity that we are then ready to apply the things that he says, hey, if you're going to have faith, here's how we live it out. So we must make sure we get that in the correct order. And so I say that this is the invitation first. And we need to talk about this at the end. I'm open. Please, let's talk, because we can't miss the order here. So Any thoughts before we get going? Thoughts or questions? And for those of you that are new, this is truly a place for thoughts and questions. So if you come across something, let us know. This is not one of the apostles, right? Correct. However, I think they define apostle because one of the prerequisites to write to be a canonized work in the Bible in the New Testament is that you would have apostleship, which is just that you were an eyewitness account to Jesus. And so he wasn't one of the 12 disciples, but he is still an apostle because he saw Jesus, walked with him. So not one of the 12, but yes, still an apostle. Anything else? Which is crazy. James did not begin to follow Jesus till after Jesus was dead. Spent his whole life with Jesus, grew up with Jesus, still said, I don't know about this guy. So be patient with those around you who are not following Jesus.
I would say it must have been hard to be a brother or sister to
Wouldn't
Jesus,
it?
right?
That's right.
He'd be so overhead. It's like, why can't you be more like brother?
That's right. All right. James chapter 1. So we'll pick up in verse 2 here shortly. I'm going to provide some introduction before we dive in. Because the section we're about to step into, we're not going to be able to tackle it all this week. We'll have to probably hit it in at least 2 sections. The heading in my Bible above verse 2 says testing of your faith. Does anyone else have a different? What does yours say, Jeremy?
Favoritism forbidden.
Say it again.
Favoritism forbidden.
In chapter 1, verse 2?
Oh, I thought you said chapter 2.
I'm sorry. That makes sense. What about chapter 1, verse 2? Trials and temptation. That's good. What does yours say, Barbara? Trials and maturity. That's good. Anybody got anything else?
Testing your faith.
Yep. Yeah, trials and maturity. What's yours at?
I got profiting from trials.
Profiting from trials. Yeah, all in the same vein there. But the idea, trials and temptations, and that's going to be where we're at. And so when we think about this idea, though, because mine says testing of your faith, and then it's got this. He begins to talk about trials and temptations. And so I think with those things in mind, testing your faith and trials and temptations, we can be tempted and feel led to believe that our faith is now going to be graded based on how well we perform under the trials and temptations. That's a temptation I think that we can feel. I don't believe that's James's heart here. Instead, I believe James is introducing to us ways that our faith will be tested. And what I mean by that is that we'll be faced with the question, can we apply our faith in the pain of trials, and can we lean into the faith when we are tempted? Is it real enough for you to really use it in those times? Let's test it. Let's put it to the test. And there's a difference. One says, hey, I've got to hold the faith so I prove myself to be faithful. That's what one says. The other says, will you put your faith to work? Will you put the riches and the benefits of faith in Christ to work in these situations so that you can endure well in seasons of trials and temptations? So there's a difference. One is fear-based, performance-based. I've got to do it. I got to make sure it measures up. The other is meant to offer life and direction in the midst of pain and temptations. So I want us to understand that's what I believe is going on here. And really, what a relevant topic in our culture today. Okay, I did some research on this. There are many reasons people are leaving the faith right now. And goodness, people are leaving. Many people are forsaking the faith. And we won't get into all the reasons, but many of the reasons, there are two common ones that you almost always see. One is explicitly stated, so when they ask people, they say this is it. The other is more under the surface that we see is really a product of our culture. So here's the explicit ones. So why do people leave the faith? People believe trials and suffering disprove the existence of God. If If you talk to anybody who was raised in the church, they would say that research shows that people who leave the faith do so because they feel that the world that they live in does not jive with the God that they were taught about. Okay, so what we see is there is no place for pain and suffering in their theology. And so in turn, what we see is the opposite of what James is going to advocate for, where we said triumph in trials. Instead, we see that trials crush faith. Okay, and we see that people leave the faith as a result of it. Now another, and this is under the surface. So if that's one, here's the other one. We think about it in light of temptations, trials and temptations. A life of indulgence is easier and more pleasurable than a life of self-control. Okay? And it doesn't take a cultural anthropologist to look at our culture and say, we pretty well live by that, right? We see as a culture, we love pleasure. In fact, we don't like when we're restricted from anything that we want. And look at what we watch, how frustrated we get now. I'm noticing when I watch Netflix now and they've introduced commercials again, I'm like, what? Like my mind doesn't even have a way to process, like, this has to take a break again. Anyway, you look at vacations, look at the technological age of ease. Or the other day I got an ad. I don't know if they know that I work from home and I sit down a lot and they can track it, but there was an ad for a $3,000 office chair. And it's like this guy with like cool glasses on. He's like moving it. It's like, it's got a cooled seat, a heated seat. I mean, it was $3,000, but it's trying to say, hey, come, let it be exactly what you need it to be. Be comfortable. While you work, be comfortable. Like, God cursed the ground and said you're going to work and you're going to sweat. And here's a $3,000 chair to make it easier. Anyways, we love to be comfortable and we love to indulge. We love to be pleasured. And we live in a culture, honestly, that thrives and operates on our pursuit of pleasure. So think about advertisements. Think about what is shoved in our face. To put it simply, people leave or dismiss the faith in general because the pull to ease and the pull to pleasure is too strong, and the appeal to faith and self-control is too weak. And so, when you think about it, under the surface, when it comes down to choosing a life of self-control or a life of indulgence, our culture is going to drift towards a life of indulgence. And so, what often crushes faith in our current day? It is trials and temptations. It is suffering and the tug for pleasure. And so James' words on faith in trials and temptations here, I would say is not just culturally relevant, but I would say it is culturally essential if we want to see our faith thrive in our culture today. Okay? And our hope is having a faith that isn't crushed or sacrificed under the weight of temptations and trials, but a faith that carries us through, a faith that makes sense of, a faith that provides joy in the midst of those things. That's the goal. That is what I believe James is going to hit at when we get into it today. And so, before we jump into the text, I like to leave space for these types of things because I want our hearts to kind of be prepared for what we're about to read. And so, I want to give you a moment to think about this question. What effect has trials or temptations had on your faith? So I want to give you a moment to think. You can journal if you want. You can just think in your head however you wish. But this is kind of just preparing our heart where we're at before we even enter into the text. So before we even get going, would anyone be willing to share something that maybe came up in your time of reflection there? Yeah, go ahead.
Sometimes, well, there was one instance in my life, like when my dad was battling with cancer, where like my faith was strengthened in the midst of those trials and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But then there have also been instances where things didn't go my way, and I allowed that to become a divisive thing in my faith too. So I can see where there's a pendulum where it can go
Sure.
either direction, especially if you're not intentional to stay rooted to Jesus and lean in on
Yeah.
Him.
Yep. So situational comes to mind. Like I've seen that happen to me. Like sometimes it produces what I hope it would. Sometimes it's the opposite. What were you gonna say, Matt?
I think it's often proves, or at least specifically like the largest struggle I've had in my life, drove me to the end of myself.
Mm.
Like it pushed me past the point of my capabilities or my ability to cope or reason or like anything I can do.
Yep.
And it was at that point that God began.
Yep.
You know, that's where I could no longer do or be, and it was just 100% what the Lord was able to do.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's good.
Trials and different than
Yeah.
the trials, it's all those hard things that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And testing my faith in the sense of how am I going to get through this? And like Matt said, you get to the end, and he literally carries you through this.
Yeah.
And gets you to the other side.
Yeah.
And you are stronger, and then when the next trial comes, over time you get stronger and stronger.
Yeah.
And the trust grows.
Mm-hmm.
Along with, you have to build a relationship. You can't just wait for the trial to come.
Yeah.
So, along with, as you mature in the Word, the Holy Spirit just imbues all of that.
Yeah.
And then when the trial comes,
Mm-hmm.
hold you up through it.
Yeah.
Temptations, on the other hand, are those tendencies to sin that we have. And those actually have been tougher.
Yeah.
Because I don't know why they're tougher, but they are. The flesh is strong in the temptations, but they have shown me again, like Matt said, I can do it, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
I have to recognize as him that's going to clean me up.
Yeah.
The Spirit, he's going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that again, then it just gives me a great faith, not only in him, in his word, just how holy thing works.
Yeah. I feel like in my reflection, I thought the same thing in that I feel like in temptation, it hurts my faith more because I'm like, man, I should have a different desire than this. Like, why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep speaking like this to my kids? Like, I should have a different heart. Like, so I feel like it does produce different things in our hearts. And so I just want us to just have a framework before we even get into this text, the understanding that the trials and the temptations that we experience have shaped our heart in a certain way. And we come to the Word with certain presuppositions and really in need to be renovated and need to be renewed. And so I want to do that little exercise for us before we get in. So James chapter 1, verse 2. Starting in verse 2, he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." And so I'm just going to pause briefly. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. And so I just want you, in light of what you just shared or in light of what you just thought about, I'm just curious when you read that, and I'm not asking you to answer, I just want you to reflect, what emotions stir in you in that time? Joy, how could I be joyful in this? Or maybe for certain trials, but not this one or not that one. That was a different story. Or I've been there, I've tried it, it doesn't work. What you got?
Something that came to me too, like when thinking about these trials and temptations, some of my trials have been brought on by my failure in a temptation.
Sure.
Right? And so that feels different.
Mm.
So muddle through that than it does when you're like unjustly
That's right.
persecuted, right?
Yeah.
So like when I'm thinking about it, it's like I can muddle through things thrown at me a lot better than I can muddle through my own
Oh, that's good.
year after year. Like, is this in my head? Did I cause this?
Yeah.
Did I cause them? How did my action cause this in my child?
Yeah.
And then it just grows, and it's really hard to know
Yep.
trials feels different, and it's also
Mhm.
motivating then, right?
Yeah.
It's like I have a part to play with. I don't want to bring my own trials on myself.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous, right?
That's right. There is a good, I can't remember the word. There's a certain term that defines there's a difference because we can experience turmoil that is the result of our sin, the result of our bad decisions. If I spend my whole life cheating or like stealing money from my work and then I go to jail, that's not a trial. Like it's a result of my sin. But a trial, which is what James has in mind here, is he's talking to persecuted Christians who are living under the Roman Empire, who are persecuting them. It's a trial that is imposed from the outside. So that is a good differentiation because there's
When I think of that, I felt like, let's go.
sure, yeah,
When I thought about like, oh, I don't, ew, I feel yucky.
Yeah.
Thinking about what I brought on myself.
yeah,
That's a different feeling. I don't feel let's go.
yeah. You're right. It is crushing. That's a great. Thanks for adding that. I think it's worth differentiating there. Yeah. So I will admit, though, I think this passage in practice is hard. Count it all joy. It hurts. It is confusing in an age specifically where there is this blasphemous theology that God never wants you to be sick, never wants you to be poor, that is reverberating throughout cultural surface level Christianity. It makes it very confusing for us to understand how to process things when we hit trials. And so it makes it hard. Count it all joy, that's tough. No, thank you. And really, something to say about it, trials don't put a smile on our face, and they shouldn't. Like, trials are hard, and they hurt. They break our heart. They are agonizing, especially when they are of various kinds, as James says. James doesn't say, hey, endure this one trial, then you'll be good. He says, endure, count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds. Ben, that's what we were talking about, situational. That means the big, the small, the major, the minor, the ones that hurt a lot, the ones that hurt a little, the ones that just pester you, and the ones that crush your body. He says, count it all joy. And so what in the world would God want us to see in trials? What is there to see? Why would we count it all joy? Why is that to our benefit? God doesn't want us, listen, to enjoy trials necessarily. He doesn't want us to act like they don't affect us. He wants us to be willing to embrace trials, not so much for what they are, but for what God sovereignly accomplishes through them. What God is doing in them if we allow Him to. Okay? And what does He accomplish through them? This is what He lays out here next. So verse 3, let's read this. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower falls, and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. And he ends it here in verse 12 with just a powerful statement. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love them. Okay, so we're going to just stop there in the text. And because we're going to hit the trials section next week, and probably the second half of the temptation, or we're going to hit the temptation section next week. Probably just hit one half of the trials this week. Here's what I want us to do. Think about in faith. So there's an outline that David Platt provides for this text that I really liked. And so I've used it here. But here's where we're going. So faith in trials. Here's what we're going to see. We learn during trials to grow in His likeness. We learn to trust in His wisdom. We learn to rely on His resources. And we learn to live for His reward. Okay, that's where we're going. Any thoughts before we get started? I say started. Any thoughts before we keep going? Let's do it. So first, we learn to grow in his likeness. We learn to grow in his likeness. So if you look at verse 2, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Verse 3, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Some translations say endurance. It produces endurance. And when steadfastness, when endurance of faith has its full effect, it leaves us perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So notice there's something in trials that accomplishes something in us that cannot be complete separate from trials. So a couple things that I want to point out here. So first is this idea of perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. Okay, I don't want you to get hung up on some of the verbiage here. Okay, this does not mean that through perseverance we can be refined to perfection in this life. It's not. It is not that you endure these things well, you'll get better. Instead, I believe James is reminding of the end goal, and that is our perfect, complete, unhindered union with Christ. He's reminding us what's at the end of this journey and pointing out that trials are a necessary step to get there. Okay? Hear this. God's goal, I think this is huge. God's goal in our lives is our maturity in Him. God's goal in our lives is maturity in Him, growth in His likeness. One day, every person is going to stand before their Creator. One day, every person is going to have to give account to their life. God is aiming to prepare us for that day. That is always what is on His mind. And this gets off, and this is where we have to be challenged. This gets off when we don't have the same goal for our life, right? When we don't have the same, if we understood the purpose of our life to be shaping us and molding us into the image of the Son, then we are willingly going to let trials come into our life, knowing that they are necessary to take us to that end. However, when our goal in life is to be successful, when our goal in life is to have a nice job, when our goal in life is to get a raise, to have a perfect family, to live the American dream, to have an easy life, then trials devastate us because they crush our goal. They crush our dreams. Not saying those things are not good desires, but they cannot be primary in our life. And so hear me, this is, if you're going to write anything, trials can lead to joy when our goal is God. Trials can lead to joy when our goal is God. But that means that our goal can't be somewhere else if we hope to walk through trials faithfully. And I'd give you the opportunity here, and I'm not going to give you a long time to reflect, but just maybe you could write it down and take some time with this later. If you think about maybe a time where suffering crushed your faith, challenged your faith, threatened to completely take it away, could you look back at that time and identify a misplaced goal? Could you identify even a dream that had gotten crushed? Could you identify something that you desired more than God, and this trial devastated it and took it away? So that's one. So second, I want you to notice what produces steadfastness here. What produces steadfastness? Notice what strengthens and matures our faith. It is not the trial. So like this adage of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger isn't necessarily true. Like there are trials that can hit that don't necessarily make us stronger if we are passive to them. It's our perseverance and patience in the trial. If you look at the text, let steadfastness, not the trial, have its full effect. Let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And so if you think about this, if we are passive towards the trials and the suffering in our life, then it will ruin us. It will ruin us. We must hold the faith in the midst of the trial for maturity to be produced in us. You know, if we just, what comes to my mind is metallurgy. Anyone ever dabbled in metallurgy? Yeah, didn't. Metallurgy, or however else you might pronounce it. Forging, there you go. Melting metal and shaping something out of it. I could have been more clear. Okay, so this process, and I'll explain it to you briefly, it is the intense, and when I say intense, the intense process. So I work for a steel company, and we will sometimes go to vendors that make the steel in-house. And they have these massive containers of just liquid hot metal. You don't want to fall in one of those suckers. And it is, you can't even stand near it. It's heated to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. It is unbelievably hot. It creates a molten metal. Now, the properties of this metal in this state are absolutely crushed. They are nothing. And they're challenged, they're compromised. And if you were to take that metal, that molten metal, and you were just to pour it on the floor, you would have a massive mess in your hands, and the burnt, all the process you took to heat that metal and get it to that state was worthless, because all it produced was a mess because there was no purpose in it. You just threw it away. Now, if you heat that metal down to this flowable magma, and then you pour it into a die, you pour it into a cast, something that has a shape, something that has a purpose, the product you get is beautiful. Because there was intentionality. This heating process had an end goal. It had a purpose. But there had to be intentionality. The process had a purpose. And so if you see this, if we want trials to not crush our faith, and if we want trials to cause it to flourish, we must make a conscious effort to count our trials as joy. Notice that that's a verb. Count our trials. It says, consider our trials. Like this is past feeling. This is thought. We have to make the effort to say, I'm going to perceive this. I'm going to filter this as something that is good and coming from the Lord. We must decide to let God work in us what He intends to do, because we trust the final product that He's making us into. And listen, it's not just James either. So if you said, I don't know if I believe this guy, let me put Paul in front of you. Paul would second the sentiment. He says in Romans chapter 5, and this is very similar language, not only that, but we rejoice, another verb. We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. And again, this same progression. Endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. You say, I don't know about Paul either. How about Peter? Same thing. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And these are men who gave their life for the faith. Peter will be hung upside down, crucified. These men understood trials, but knew they served a purpose. And so, if we want to follow Jesus and reach the glorious end of eternal life with Him, then we have to recognize that to go to a place where there is no more sin and no more suffering, we're going to encounter suffering along the way. But what should set Christians apart is our willingness, our intentionality to believe, our willingness to count it all joy, and believe in the purpose of suffering, and believe that the treasure at the end is worth it all. This sets us apart. So, we learn to count it all joy in suffering, so that God might refine us, we grow in His likeness. That's the first thing. Next, we learn to trust in His wisdom. Trust in His wisdom. Okay, so if you look at verse 5 here, this seems to be out of context, at least at first glance. So if you go here, this is what it says. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. And so just pause there a second. We have to be clear about something in this passage, because there are different interpretations of what James was trying to accomplish here. There's one side, there's some folks who say that James was trying to hit a few different topics here. So he wanted to talk about trials, then he wanted to talk about wisdom. Later he talks about possessions and then temptations. So it's like these unassociated topics they just wanted to hit differently. I'm going to give them a little word to maybe quiet a little bit. Okay, so some have said, hey, these are just disconnected themes that you need to hit separately. I have taken the approach that I believe that we should be reading this section on wisdom, and the next section we'll read on resources under the umbrella of trials. And I say that because of the mention of wisdom in verse 2 and in verse 12. So these things, it's like it's bookended. So you see trials at verse 2, trials at verse 12. And so I'm assuming everything in between that was meant to serve the same purpose. Because you see, verse 2, count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds. Verse 12, after the discussion on wisdom, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. So for that reason, we're going to look at wisdom and possessions under the realm of trials and suffering. Okay? So, with that being said, we go to the text. And he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. So listen, in relation to trials, if there is anything that we lack, it is usually wisdom. That is often what makes trials so challenging. A lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding. Because the questions like, why is this happening? Will it get better? Will I get better? Why would you take them from me? What do I do? These are the questions that burn within us in seasons of trials. And listen, those questions hurt. And not having answers is hard. And we can understand that. We can meet there. Seemingly, if there is anything that can be improved in this life by knowledge and understanding, it would be the question that has plagued everybody who has walked on this broken world. Why do I have to experience the pain and suffering that I do? That is the question. And James says, when you find yourself there, lean into the one who has perfect wisdom. Okay? I'll tell you what I think he means by that. Turn to the one who has knowledge of all the unanswered questions that you have in suffering. Turn to the one who can see your life from every point of view, every perspective, not just your viewpoint, which is right where your feet are alone. Now, this doesn't mean that we expect all the answers to our questions. You may never get them. Certainly, you will not get all of them. That's not the wisdom we seek. The Bible reminds us that wisdom, if you look throughout the book of Proverbs, what is wisdom? Wisdom is a fear of the Lord. Wisdom is placing ourselves under the authority, under the supremacy of the Lord. And when we do that, our life begins to be shaped by His influence and authority. And as it relates to trials specifically, when we place ourselves properly under God, it's okay for us to still have our questions. It is okay for those things to still hurt because they are going to hurt. But when we have placed ourselves under the authority of God, under the care of God, we grow content with not having to have all the answers because we trust ourselves in the hands of a loving God. Now, I shared this story. We did a three-session series on God and suffering, like, when was that? February? No, earlier this year. And I shared this story that I think is also relevant here. So I guess when Grayson, who's our oldest, when she was like 2 or 3, and we were first-time parents, and she had gotten sick. She was not keeping anything down. She was dehydrated. Anything you gave her, she would throw up. And so we got to the point where we were like, we need to get her to the doctor because we don't really know what to do here. And so we take this like pitiful little girl, carrying her to the hospital. We go to the emergency room, and they say, yeah, she's sick. She needs fluid right now. And so we set her in this very scary environment, right? They tell her to put this robe on. They tell her to sit on this uncomfortable chair with this weird paper behind it. And they're like, just relax. And I am like, I'm a very like emotional person. So I'm in that. I am stressed. I'm scared. I'm for her. But they tell me, hey, she needs to get an IV in. Like there's not another option. And so I recognize this is not going to be a good time. But I also know it's necessary. Like if she's going to feel better, this has got to happen. And so I remember telling Grayson, I was like, hey, this is what they're going to do. This person you don't know is going to stick this thing that you have no idea what it is in your arm, and it's going to hurt. I didn't explain it like that, but I said, and she's like, no, Daddy, you can't do this. And I was like, you have to have it. You are sick. And so they come in with this needle, and she begins to get frantic. Like I can see it. And I'm like, listen, Grayson, you're okay. I promise. Just trust me. And she begins to pull like she's not going to let them do it. And so I have to get on top of her and hold her arms down. And I can't touch her face. All I can do is look in her eyes. And I'm saying, you got to trust me. Like, I know you don't understand. I know this is painful, but you got to trust me. And she said, why are they doing this? Why are you letting them do this? And I'm just having to try to get her to trust me like this has to happen for you to get better. She eventually relaxes her body. There is still fear in her eyes. There is still pain. It hurts her and she's scared, but she's relaxed and allowing it to happen. Why? Because she trusts me. Because she knows that I love her. And she has seen that I love her. This is what it means to seek wisdom in trials. We don't as much look for understanding it at all the times of why it's happening, of what is happening, but we trust the love of God and know that He is wise enough to do to us what only we need. This is what it means to put ourselves under the authority of God. To that day, I don't know that I've cried more than that moment, and I've cried a lot, but that was scary. So this is putting ourselves under the love of God. Now, I believe there's more for us in this passage here that I want to try to finish up, and that's what we're going to do. So if you look at the second part of this in verse 5, starting in verse 6, there's this passage that I wrestled with a lot in preparation. I wasn't really sure how to deal with it. But it says this, let him ask in faith, with no doubting. This is in light of wisdom. With no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Okay, so this sounded harsh to me at first. I was like, I don't know how to make sense of it at first. But I think it points to a reality that we can relate to today. And it's this. Through my study, I believe this is not saying that we have to have perfect faith if we want things to happen. That we have to have zero doubts if we want wisdom. I don't believe that's what James is saying. But I do believe when he mentions doubt, that he is pointing out that we cannot have a divided faith. A divided faith. A faith in God, and hear this, a faith in God that is coupled with our wisdom and control. Where we're holding both of those things. A faith where God is an accessory to our life as long as things are good. And it is an accessory to accomplish what we want to accomplish in this life. A faith that is active as long as it makes sense to us, as long as it's convenient and helps us accomplish our dreams. And listen, if this divided faith, and I think we can all put skin on that. We all understand what that feels like at times. If we live in this divided faith, it is these trials that will absolutely wreck us. As James says, we'll be like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. We will be unstable because we haven't put our feet securely in any place. So because our faith is divided, and when rubber meets the road and we have to decide what we're going to believe in trials, we're pulled between trusting in God, but also holding on to this facade of maintaining the control and influence in our own life. And it's here that James says is a dangerous place. But also, it is here that we find ourselves in our self-made, lacking in nothing, knowing of everything American Christian culture. People, listen, I'm afraid we have no idea how the luxuries and opportunities available to us in our society has weakened our faith, and it may only be revealed when we face trials. We may have no idea how the luxury and opportunity and everything around us that gives us everything that we need, we have no idea what that has done to our heart till we're hit with trials and we don't know where to go. It is, and the American dream gospel works until sickness hits. The American dream gospel works until we lose what we love, until our dream is crushed. And then where do you stand? It is in suffering that we may discover our faith has been divided, because it threatens the things that we have thought have been necessary our whole life, and leaves us to wrestle with the question that we all have to wrestle with, specifically in trials, and that is this: if I only had God, would it be enough for me? That is the question that we all must wrestle with. If I only had God, would it be enough? And I got to wrap us up here, because this is as far as we're going to get today. And this question is a variation of the question I asked a little while ago about what is your goal? What is your goal in life? Because we said that trials can only be a joy if our goal is God. And then again, trials, we will only be able to stand up in trials if we are good with only God, if trials take everything else away. And so I'm going to give you this question to write down, to reflect on, to consider, and I think just bring those things to the Lord. I think even think critically about the way that our culture has shaped us. We don't even know the ways that we have grown dependent on the things that we have just by nature in our culture. So wrestle with those things. Take some time to reflect. How can our faith persevere? How can our faith not be crushed by trials? Our goal must be God. And listen, we can have all the information in the world. We can know the right answers, but remember, count it all joy is a verb. We have to choose to decide this is how we want to perceive the things that encounter our life. So I'm going to end with this. As always, we are here for you in your faith journey. Like, what we want is for, like, if you find something here that you wrestle with and you're not sure of, something in the text that doesn't make sense, that's what we're here for. We want to walk with you, do life with you, bring understanding, show you how Jesus is the hope and life of the world, and walk in that way. So just know always that we can go deeper than we go here on Monday nights, and in fact, we'd be pleased to do it. So catch me afterwards if you'd like to talk about that. I had about 7 more pages. I don't think we're going to get to it tonight. So let me pray, and then we'll get our kids. Lord, you are, as I reflect on it, your way of life is really the only way to make sense of the most traumatic thing that can happen to us, which is death. And downstream from that, every trial that comes from sin and suffering can only be made sense of by thinking about your holiness and your love, and how you have invited us in to not just see and understand trials to be something that you're using in your great sovereignty to refine us and to make us more like Christ, but it's also something that you want us to take hold of and have faith and peace and joy in the midst of these things. You could have just said, Lord, you could have said, just grit your teeth and get through it. But you said, no, my goal for you is joy in this. And so, Lord, I pray that you would work in our hearts so that we might be taken from where we might be as it relates to trials to a place of joy, to a place of trust, to a place of leaning into your wisdom. Lord, would you let trials in our life be something that lead us not to leave the faith? Would you cause it not to crush our faith, but would you allow it to shore up and to be life-giving for us in the form of faith in trials? So, Lord, we're thankful for this word. Would you use it this week in our hearts? It's in your name we pray. Amen.